uprisings, and both of them essentially brought the Revolutionary War to this part of the state. We brought it to the valleys of the Normanskill and the Schoharie Valley, and these two battles both have, each has a distinction, one being a first and one being an only. The Battle of the Flockey was the first, recognized as being the first cavalry charge of the United States Army. And the Battle of Normanskill is the only battle of the Revolution that was fought within the current boundaries of Albany County. So we're going to take these battles apart and put them back together, so you not only know what happened, because they were both pretty brief encounters, but there's a lot to learn about what motivated the participants as well as the results of them afterwards. This is the period of time that we're going to be looking at from July to mid-August in 1777. Especially the 11th, 12th, and 13th, that's when the battles actually occurred. And this was a chaotic time in upstate New York. This was, a lot of things were happening at the same time, a lot of simultaneous events, and we're going to look at them one at a time. But keep in mind that there was a lot of decision making that had to go on, a lot of prioritizing that had to go on, because there were threats that were happening all at the same time. This is what I like to call messy history. It's not the same simplified version you get from a textbook, but it makes it a lot more interesting to be messy, I think. Who were the factions involved in these battles? This indeed was a civil war, as we'll see on the frontiers. They both were loyalist uprisings, so we'll look at the loyalists first. These were the men that lived in the area that we're looking at, that were decided to remain loyal to the British Crown. They were not in favor of independence of the colonies from Great Britain, and they were local residents in the frontier areas that we're looking at. They were in the majority, and this includes the Native Americans. The Native Americans, by and large, sided with the British in these areas that we're talking about. And the groups of Tories were by and large not politically or militarily particularly well organized, but there were some that were taking support and instruction from British operatives, from British military communication. And this period of time that we're looking at is a full 2 years after the Revolutionary War started, with the battles of Lexington and Concord in 1775. And during that period of time, in the interim, many of these loyalist Tory groups had been oppressed, they've been disarmed, they've been arrested, in rare cases they were executed, and the relationship with the Patriot Committees was not good, and this was another reason that the Loyalists decided this was a time to rise up. They had had enough. On the other side, we have the Patriots, what I'm going to be calling the Patriots. These are our so-called founding fathers of our country. These are the people that were favoring independence from Great Britain, and in 1777, they were in control of the upstate New York interim government. The New York City area was all occupied by the British, New York City and Long Island, but upstate New York was in control of the Patriots. And the interim government was organized into committees of safety or committees of correspondence that were elected at the county level, and subcommittees of those committees were in charge of the districts within the counties. Each county was divided into districts. At the state level, we had a governor and a New York State Council of Safety. It was kind of an executive council, and they were in charge of making military decisions for the state government, and they met at Kingston. The New York State actually had adopted a constitution by this period of time, earlier in 1777, but the government as we know it was not in charge yet, because the process of elections and appointing state officials had not played itself out yet, so the Council of Safety was still in charge for a little while longer. Both of these battles also have a contingent of Continental soldiers. And these Continental soldiers were in some way either temporarily or permanently attached to the Northern Department of the Continental Army, operating at this time north of Albany under the command of General Philip Schuyler of Albany. And what's the area of land that we're going to be looking at today for these, the home of these loyalists that rose up? This is within the green boundaries here. I can point it out a little bit better, I guess. Within the green boundaries here, going off the map a little to the north and to the south, is the bounds of Old Albany County as it existed in 1777. It also included the Old Dutch patroonships, the Manor of Rensselaer and Livingston Manor, and the area of Albany County in 1777 includes the area of several counties today, including Rensselaer County, Columbia County, Saratoga, Schenectady, Schoharie, Greene, and probably some parts of others as well. And if we zoom in a little bit more, we'll look at the actual area we're going to be talking about. We're looking at the northwest corner of the Manor of Rensselaer. This would be known as the Helleberg area on some maps. This is the Normanskill Creek here that we'll be looking at in more detail later. We'll be looking at the Schenectady area and a section of the Schoharie Valley, which was at 1777 was on the western frontier of Old Albany County. And if we zoom in on the, two hits, there we go. We zoom in on the area of the Schoharie Valley we'll be looking at two Tory groups in the Schoharie Valley. One at Foxestown. Foxestown is where you're sitting right now. This was the area where the Fox Creek flows into the Schoharie Creek. It was the crossroads of the valley where the Albany Road and the Schenectady Road and the Kings Highway in the valley all met. The other group of Tories we'll be looking at are further up the Schoharie Creek. The Schoharie Creek flows north, so going up the creek is going down on the map. So always remember that. Because I'll be talking about the upper valley and it's actually the lower part of the map. But this other section of where the other group of Tories we'll be looking at is a section about 7 miles long of the Schoharie Valley from Weiserstown to Breakabeen. Weiserstown being the current location of the village of Middleburg, and Breakabeen being, well, Breakabeen. One of the few that hasn't changed its names over the last 250 years. These are the districts of Old Albany County. This map is not exactly to scale, but there were 15 districts in Old Albany County. Many of them had committees of safety or committees of correspondence. The ones we'll be looking at will be the northwest corner of the Manor of Rensselaer on the western side of the Hudson. That I don't believe did have its own committee because the Schenectady committee from the Schenectady district was in charge of the northern part of that district. So that's where we'll be talking about the Battle of the Normanskill. And on the western frontier of Old Albany County was the United Districts of Duanesburg and Schoharie. And if there's nobody here from Duanesburg today, I'm going to call that the Schoharie District. I don't see anybody. 15 districts, but there were 17 Patriot militia regiments. The term militia, as it'll be used today, I'll always be talking about Patriot forces. Sometimes people talk about loyalist militia as well, but strictly speaking, the militia I'll be talking about today will always be on the Patriot side. And there's two militia regiments that we'll be talking about. One would be the Schenectady District Militia Regiment, which was the Albany 2nd Militia, and the Schoharie Militia, which was the Albany 15th Militia.
What is that below Coxsackie? Great?
Great Inbal. I'm not really sure what that corresponds to today. But below that was Ulster County in those days. What exactly was the Tories' motivation to rise up at this particular time? Well, as we explained earlier, local Tory grievances were boiling over. They've been oppressed for 2 years or more, and we're starting to say enough was enough. That was the local impetus. But in the bigger picture, the military picture was that New York, upstate New York was being invaded by the British. This was a plan that had been hatched by John Burgoyne in London early in 1777 and sold to Lord Germain, who was in charge of the military operations in the colonies. Burgoyne's three-part plan, had the British invading New York from 3 different directions at once, from the north, from the south, and from the west. And this would be handled by Burgoyne himself, Brigadier General Barry St. Ledger, and Sir Henry Clinton. Albany was the prize. All three would meet at Albany. If they converged on Albany, it was mission accomplished. And the plan, importantly for the Tories, the plan assumed and depended on Tory support every step of the way, both in terms of manpower and in terms of provisioning the army for the British, because they wouldn't be able to do it on their own. This is what Burgoyne's plan looked like on paper, on a map of New York. John Burgoyne left Canada middle of June 1777 with a force of about 7,000 or 8,000 men, came down the Champlain corridor, and his job was to reach Albany from the north, taking the Champlain and Lake George corridor. Barry St. Ledger was going to invade New York from Oswego and come down the Lake Oneida corridor down the Mohawk to meet Burgoyne in Albany. And Sir Henry Clinton was coming up from British-occupied New York City, sailing up the Hudson to Albany. Where each of these legs of the invasion force was cut off is where I have the red hatch marks here. That was as far as each of those got, and this is why. St. Ledger on the Mohawk route encountered much stiffer resistance than he anticipated at Fort Stanwix. He was never able to take the fort. And of course, the very bloody Battle of Oriskany on August 6th was turned back to both sides, essentially. And keep in mind that August 6th is well within the time frame that we're going to be talking about. So the threat from the west was always there up until about August 8th, when the news about Oriskany reached old Albany County. Sir Henry Clinton on the Hudson route coming up from the south was put at a distinct disadvantage because his commanding officer, William Howe, decided either to ignore Burgoyne's plan or for whatever reason had ambiguous orders. He sailed instead of for Albany, he sailed for Philadelphia. This left Clinton without enough men and without enough time to ever reach Albany in time to be of any assistance to Burgoyne. So Burgoyne was essentially on his own, facing the Northern Department of the Continental Army. And he wasn't doing so bad on his own. By July 6th, he had taken Fort Ticonderoga. And Ticonderoga was one of those events that caused a psychological shift between the Patriot and Loyalist allegiances. It caused a shift more towards the Loyalist side, because by the time Burgoyne had taken Ticonderoga, everyone at that point felt that he was probably going to be marching on Albany within a matter of days. So I like to look at the analogy of the Patriot and Loyalist allegiances. As a farmer, I look at a field, and a field can be cut down the middle by a fence. You can have Loyalists on one side, Patriots on the other side. And early on in the conflict, the fence was in disrepair. It was easy to jump from one side to the other. Many did so multiple times, back and forth, depending on how your side was doing or how the other side was doing at the time. So the fence divided communities and families, but early on it was not a strong divide. You could jump it easily, and many did so multiple times when things were not going so well for their side. This takes us to some correspondence that tells us a little bit about how the Patriots felt about the fall of Fort Ticonderoga. And this is a quote that says, "This is a letter from the Schoharie Committee to the New York State Council of Safety." It says, and they're talking about Ticonderoga here, it says, "It has such effect upon numbers here that many we thought steady friends to the state seem to draw back. Only a fraction of the militia in Schoharie and Schenectady were turning out when called upon. No one wanted to be associated with the side that appeared to be losing, which was the Patriots side at that point. Patriots were jumping the fence to the Loyalist side, causing Tories to rally in increasing numbers and becoming their own local threat. The depleted militias were trying to deal then with the local Tories as well as the threats from the north and from the west." This takes us then to the Battle of Normanskill. And although this marker has been in place since 1954, we're going to rewrite a few letters on there today and erase some cast iron words with some facts. What we know about the Battle of Normanskill comes primarily from the minutes of the Schenectady Committee of Safety. And early in July, or late in July, I should say, there was this constant push and pull of militia manpower and supplies to deal with Burgoyne, the Mohawk Valley threat, and the local Tories all at the same time, as we've been saying. This led to, by August 2nd, the Schenectady Committee deciding that they couldn't deal with it on their own. They requested that some Continental troops be sent to help them out. They wanted 60 troops from the Continental Army to be sent to help them. And this is likely when the Massachusetts 9th, or a detachment of the Massachusetts 9th Regiment was sent there. We know they were there a few days later for the Battle of Normanskill, and this request is likely when that detachment was sent to Schenectady. It was known as Colonel Wessing's regiment, and they were spread in small detachments throughout the Mohawk Valley from Fort Stanwix to Schenectady. That's one of the facts that we're going to correct on that sign, by the way. Move up to August 10th and 11th in the Schenectady Committee minutes. There were reports coming into the Schenectady Committee that 300 Tories were disarming residents and causing havoc in the Schenectady and Normanskill area. The Albany County 2nd Militia was instructed to stay in town, not to march north if they were requested to go to help Schuyler against Burgoyne, and they were put on a 24-hour watch. And by August 11th, at 3 p.m., the Schenectady Committee sent Lieutenant Colonel Jacob Skimmerhorn of the militia to the Normanskill to check to see what was going on with this group of Tories. He came back and reported that very same day that the Tories had been at Thomas Morale's and then Nicholas Van Patten's farm by the morning of August 11th. And the Schenectady Committee took decisive action that very same night and decided to send some troops there to deal with the Tories. And they asked Major Abram Switz of the Albany County 2nd Militia and Captain Abram Childs, who was there commanding the detachment of the Massachusetts 9th, sent them to Normanskill with about 100 men. This is my depiction of the movements of the battle here. This is Schenectady on the old 1762 map. The blue arrows indicate the movement of the Patriot forces. This is the movement of the 100 men from Schenectady. The 7 miles or so to the farm of Nicholas Van Patten at the Normanskill. And they probably surprised the Tories in the middle of the night. This was either late on the 11th or early on the 12th of August. And they surrounded the farm and barn of the house and barn of Nicholas Van Patten, where the Tories were holed up. said, they probably were sleeping or probably had some sentries out, but by and large, they were surprised. And if you don't mind right now, I'm gonna pause the battle for just a minute to show you something really cool about where this battle is located. The yellow box there, I've expanded into a Google Earth image here of modern day. And the landmark that we need to use is the location where the Normanskill Creek intersects with the Schoharie Albany Road, which is this road that goes horizontally here across the frame. Where that circle is where the two intersect. Today, that intersection occurs right next to Tawasinta Park on Route 146, where the new bridge is being built. That's where the Normanskill crosses the old Albany Road, which essentially is Route 146 today. If you go about a half mile north from there, you encounter the cul-de-sac end of Bosberg Road. A couple hundred yards up Bosberg Road, there's an old barn. That, according to the Gilliland people who have done the research within the last couple of years, and we'll talk about who that is at the end, that they believe is Nicholas Van Patten's barn, or what's left of it. So that is the exact location where the battle took place. We go back to the battle now. The troops have surrounded the Tories. Shots are exchanged back and forth. One of the Tories is hit, one of the Tories is killed. 11 prisoners are eventually taken back to Schenectady. Some of the prisoners are poked out of the barn at the point of a bayonet. As they say, they were hiding in the hay. So the other arrow there depicts the movement of the troops and prisoners back to Schenectady. Within a few days, the prisoners were taken to Albany, and to be honest, by the end of August, most of them had been released. There just wasn't enough room in the jails at Albany for all the Tories that needed arresting. So David Springer is the name of the Tory that was killed. He was one of the organizers, and quite often, he's not here today, when I'm giving this talk, often my friend Joe Cicluna, who's the president of my SAR chapter, is here. He's a descendant of the Springer family, and he doesn't come to harass me or to settle any scores, because he's from the other side of the Springer family. The Springer family was one of those families that was split down the middle by the Revolution. David Springer, being a Tory, lost his life because of it. Benjamin Springer, who was the ancestor of my friend Joe, was on the Patriot side of the family and survived the war. One more thing to say about the 11 prisoners that were taken in the Battle of Normanskill is that 2 of them had ties to Schoharie. One of them was by the name of Jacob Mann, who had a brother here by the name of George Mann, who was the proprietor of the George Mann Tavern that many of you are familiar with. The end result of the Battle of Normanskill was that the Tories were dispersed. That essentially was mission accomplished for what they set out to do at the time. Now we're going to move through the situation in the Schoharie Valley at the time, and we're going to look at some correspondence. I'm going to quote a letter from Colonel Peter Brome, who was the head of the Schoharie militia, and he describes the situation of the people in Schoharie to the New York State Council. He said, "Threats they hourly receive. Their persons and property are exposed to imminent danger. Nearly one half of the people heretofore well disposed have laid down their arms and proposed to side with the enemy." This was a preamble of sorts of Colonel Brome to a request for troops. He was looking, as Schenectady got, he was looking for some Continental troops to help deal with the Tory threat that was growing by the day. And this is how the New York State Council responded to the Schoharie Committee's request. "Gentlemen, it greatly astonishes this council that the settlement of Schoharie, which has always been considered as firmly and spiritedly attached to the American cause, should be panic-struck upon the least appearance of danger. A few worthless Indians and a set of villains who have basically deserted their country are all the enemies you have to fear. Needless to say, Schoharie wasn't getting any troops right away. And believe it or not, things were about to get worse. This is a map of Fox's Town, a 1762 map, but you get the idea. The Schoharie Albany Road that we just looked at in Normanskill, the other end of it's right here. It was the convergence of that road and the highway that went north and south of the valley, and the Schoharie Road also intersected here, not very far away. This was the crossroads of the valley. This is the location of the Man Tavern, as you see here, much as it appears today. This was the location of the old Dutch church across the road that would become known as the Lower Fort later on in the war. And being the crossroads in the valley, this was where the troops mustered when they were about to be deployed somewhere, the troops of the militia. And this was the case on August 8, 1777. There were two companies that were being sent north. Although depleted in numbers, they were going to either provision or supply manpower for the Northern Army north of Albany against Burgoyne. And one of the companies was the first company under the command of Captain George Mann, the proprietor of the tavern. Captain Mann addressed his troops before they were about to march, and he started talking in vagaries about the propriety of siding with the enemy, but eventually he came out with it and said straight out that he decided he was a friend of King George, and all of the men there who would follow him in that regard should step forward, and a number of the militia did so. And this was like the Patriots' worst nightmare. There was total confusion and paralysis. The march was called off. Patriots were jumping the fence to the Loyalist side in droves. Oaths were being signed, oaths were being torn up. This is an example of one of the oaths on the Tory side that was being offered. It said, "We, the subscribers, do voluntarily and without compulsion take protection under the Indians who are now invading these territories, as we see no other help for the preservation of our properties. If you were on the losing side, the chances are you would lose everything." So, the amazing thing about this was that it did not lead to an armed encounter. The cooler heads prevailed. George Mann was not a particularly violent man, and it did not result in an armed encounter. And this mayhem kind of persisted in Fox's Town for a number of days afterwards. Now we're going to move up the valley, south, to another section of the Schoharie Valley that I pointed out to you earlier, from Weiserstown south to Breakabeen. The Schoharie Creek snaking the wiggly line up through the middle here. And this white area on this Google Earth image to the west of the Schoharie Creek is the floodplain of the Schoharie, known in those days as Broman's Land. Under the watchful cliffs of Anistagrawa, which is the hill we know today as Roman's Nose. At the southern end of Broman's Land, or the northern location of Bob's Island, if you're familiar with the area, was the location where and is the location today where the Breakabeen Creek flows into the Schoharie Creek from the west. And in doing so, it crosses the floodplain and creates a wetland there that was known in those days as the Flockey. Flockey being an anglicized German word that means flat or level or shallow, that aptly described the wetland. This was also the location of the farm of Adam Chrysler, the farm and mill of Adam Chrysler. And Adam Chrysler was an ardent Tory, And by August 8, 1777, he had gathered together a small army of Tories and Native Americans. He was also a great friend of the Schoharie Indians in the valley. And he had gathered together about 85 Tories, 10 Native Americans. And he was instructed by Joseph Brant to wait in readiness for Brant's arrival in the valley to join forces with him. Now, why was Joseph Brant giving instructions to Adam Chrysler, and who was Joseph Brant? Joseph Brant was a Mohawk war chief, very closely allied with the British. He was a captain's commission in the British Army, commanding a company of Tories and Native Americans known as Brant's Volunteers. And he was in contact with Chrysler because Chrysler was sure that he was in contact with Chrysler because Brant was sure that he was going to be marching through the Schoharie Valley at any time because he was with St. Ledger's party, and he was going to be passing through there on his way to Albany to join forces with Burgoyne. And this is an example of the penmanship of Joseph Brant here. As you can see, his letters are very readable in terms of penmanship, not so much in terms of spelling and grammar. But this is an actual letter that's on display at the Old Stone Fort Museum, and actually written by Joseph Brant. Not the one that Chrysler received, but it is another letter, so you get an idea. Move up to August 9th, now a day later. Chrysler is joined in the valley by John McDonald. John McDonald was sent from Oswego by Sir John Johnson to join forces with Chrysler in the valley. And John McDonald was from Charlotte Creek, and he had recruited on his way in the upper Susquehanna another group of Tories. And on his way into the Schoharie Valley, they had raided Harper's Field and sent some of the Patriots scrambling and taken some prisoners on the way as well. And together now, between Chrysler and McDonald, they had about 130 men altogether, and they had a very military strategy. The arrows I have here depicting what they had were small groups. They were sending out small parties, scouring the valley, recruiting loyalists, taking prisoners of the Patriots, confiscating weapons, cattle, and provisions, and working their way north from Chrysler's to the farm of Peter Swart, which they confiscated. This was within striking distance of Weiserstown, where the Patriots were gathering. This was less than 2 miles away. Now, what were the Patriots up to at this point? The Patriots were gathering in Weiserstown at the most substantial building in Weiserstown. This was the stone house of Johannes Becker, which they dubbed at that point Fort Defiance. And that's not a misspelling, that's the way they spelled it. They dubbed it Fort Defiance because they decided to defy an ultimatum that the Tories had sent to them from Swart's farm. The Tories had sent an ultimatum to the Patriots of Weiserstown saying that if you surrender your position, if you surrender your part of the valley, we'll allow you to walk away. Otherwise, we're going to take it by force. So the Tories had sent this ultimatum, and the Patriots at Johannes Becker's stone house, after much deliberation, decided they were not going to respond to that ultimatum. And they fully expected that the Tories were going to attack at any point. There were only 30 Patriots to be had at Johannes Becker's stone house, because of the mayhem that was still going on at Foxestown, as well as the loyalists recruiting and a lot of the Patriots jumping the fence to the loyalist side. The Patriots were desperately seeking reinforcements from Albany. They had sent two parties of 2 men each to Albany to try and recruit, without success. And about this time, they were joined in the at the Fort Defiance by Colonel John Harper of Tryon County, who declared that the whole country was in alarm. This was because he was trying himself to recruit a company of Rangers to deal with the Tories, and he was unable to find anyone who would serve. Harper was a man of action, and he decided that the only way that anything was going to happen before the Tories attacked was if somebody rode to Albany on horseback to get back in time before the Tories attacked. So John Harper, on the night of August 11th, rode on horseback headed for Albany. And his journey there is a story unto itself. That could be a whole hour's talk unto itself. There's a lot of legend and lore about his journey to Albany. But the bottom line was, on the morning of August 13th, he rode back into Foxestown on the Albany Road at the head of a troop of 28 of the 2nd Continental Light Dragoons, commanded by a French officer by the name of Captain Jean de Bernajoux. And this was an incredible show of force in the valley. The Dragoons are heavily armed. They have 2 pistols slung over their saddle in the front. At their right hand they have a carbine. At their left hand they have a saber. And this was a show of force in the valley like most had never seen. And this caused some of George Mann's Tories, who had just jumped over to the Tory side, to jump back over to the Patriot side now, because they thought now the Patriots were going to have the upper hand in the valley with this cavalry detachment that was there now. Some of the ones that did not, the Tories that did not decide to jump back to the Patriot side, were taken as prisoners. And the Dragoons had ridden all night, and the horses needed a rest. They stopped briefly at Snyder's Tavern in Foxestown, and then they were ready to ride to relieve Fort Defiance. This is a Dragoon helmet that's on display next door across the road. This is, as far as we know, the only photograph that exists of Fort Defiance, the Becker Stone House. Not to be confused with the Becker Stone House on Fox's Creek, because that one is still lived in and it still exists. This one was in ruins when this picture was taken in the early 20th century, and there's nothing at all left of it now. But the Dragoons, after a short rest, rode to Fort Defiance and discovered that the Tories had not attacked yet. And that leaves some historians scratching their head as to why the Tories sat at Peter Swart's farm for quite a period of time without advancing further. And we'll get to that a little bit at the end about one of the documents that I passed around there to shed some light on that. The Dragoons were ready to ride and engage the Tories. De Bernajoux was anxious to do that, but they had one small problem. They had these prisoners that they were dragging along behind them from Foxestown, and they didn't want to leave a detachment behind to guard them. They needed all the troops they could get. So what they did have was a substantial stone structure with a good roof on it and a ladder. They put the ladder up against the house, pushed the prisoners up to the roof, took the ladder away. They could escape at their peril. The Dragoons rode on to the valley south to engage the Tories. By this time, that's the blue arrow here is the Dragoons. The timing here may be a little off, but this is the movement of the Tories from Swart's farm. The Tories by this time got word that the Dragoons were on the way, the cavalry was on the way. They decided that the flat floodplain of the Schoharie at Swart's farm was no place to face a cavalry charge. That would have been utter suicide. So Chrysler and McDonald called for a retreat 2 miles back to Chrysler's to the Flockey. There was more vegetation there for cover. There were the farm buildings and mill buildings that they could use for cover. And they said what Chrysler claimed was an ambush there. At the same time, Chrysler was afraid that the Patriots would be attacking from the south at the same time. So he took 35 of his local Tory men that were from the valley and sent them to Breakabeen to cover the southern approach. They made ready for battle at the Flockey. Chrysler said they said an ambush, but that's highly unlikely. This is what the area looks like from the cliffs of Anistagrawa. And incidentally, if you've never taken the short hike up there, this is the reward you get, and it's well worth it. And we can't talk about Groman's Nose and this part of the valley without at least mentioning Tim Murphy. If you stand here on the cliffs, you can stand in the exact place where Tim Murphy jumped off carrying 2 pails of milk, having just milked his cow and pursued by the enemy because they wanted his milk apparently. He jumped into the valley without spilling a drop. That's not the exciting part of the story. When he landed, he sunk in the deep Schoharie topsoil so deeply that he had to go home and get a shovel to dig himself out. Now, if I haven't lost all credibility, we'll go back to the Tories. This is the movement of the Tories from Swartz Farm, which would have been one of these places here. I'm not sure exactly which, so I haven't drawn a circle around it. But this is their movement south to Chrysler's Farm in the Flockey, in this area at the very end of what we call Roman's Land. The Dragoons were not far behind, probably taking the western bank of the Schoharie to catch up with the Tories. And although Chrysler said he set an ambush in the Flockey, an ambush would imply that the Dragoons did not know where the Tories were, which I think is highly unlikely. They certainly knew where to go, and the horses formed up outside of the Flockey when they got there, and the Tories got the first shots off. If you believe the Tory side of the story, it was a concentrated volley of musket fire. If you believe the Patriot side of the story, it was sporadic gunfire. But anyway, the Dragoons returned fire from their pistols or from their carbines, and by this time, Captain de Vernajou was getting impatient. He was ready to sound the charge. The Cornet Conley sounded it on the horn, and the troops with firearms holstered, sabers drawn, charged into the Flockey to drive the Tories out. These, by the way, are not AI-generated images. These are real people. These are real reenactors that were at Schoharie in 2017, I believe. The Tories had nowhere to go. They could only go up out of the valley on this very steep slope, heavily vegetated area. The Tory side of the story says that there was another musket volley, a second line, and another musket volley as the Dragoons charged into the Flockey. But the Tories had to scramble up out of the valley to get away from the charging horses and the sabers. At this point, both sides were trying to figure out what to do next. The horses really couldn't negotiate the steep terrain either, and the Tories were not really willing to re-attack and to keep firing from their position where they were. Fortunately or unfortunately, a thunderstorm intervened and stopped the fighting. And that was pretty much the end of the Battle of the Flockey. The results were as such. The Dragoons had suffered 3 casualties. One, Lieutenant Word and his horse were both killed outright by the first musket fire. Another Dragoon was mortally injured and died a few days later, and a third had a minor injury. So I guess you could say there were really 4 casualties if you count the horse. The Tories were either dispersed, the local Tories pretty much went home. The others fled with McDonald back to Oswego, where the forces of St. Ledger were still besieging the Fort Stanwix. 45 of those men that retreated there joined up with the King's Royal Regiment of New York, the Loyalist Regiment that was commanded by Sir John Johnson, and they went to Canada and left their families and farms behind. And in the mayhem that was the retreat to Chrysler's farm, to the Flockey, and the route from the valley, most of the prisoners that the Tories had taken managed to escape. There are only 3 that we know of that were taken to Canada against their will at that point. And also, there was a lot of baggage left behind by the Tories in those retreats. And one item was the backpack of John MacDonald, which contained all of his correspondence. So that was a boon to the intelligence for the Patriots. We take a look now at both battles and what the impacts really were. In both cases, the Tory threat was reduced by decisive action by the Schenectady Committee and by the Patriots in the Schoharie Valley, by Colonel Harbour especially. The Tories were driven off and prevented from organizing. This denied, at least in a small way, Burgoyne getting some of the resources he needed in terms of manpower and provisions that they could have provided for him. This secured Patriots' control of agricultural territory, especially in the Schoharie Valley. And I think the most important effect was a psychological effect. It had a boost in confidence to the local Patriot committees and militias that allowed them to send more troops north and supplies as well. This kept the supplies out of the hands of Burgoyne, and it boosted the militia numbers greatly with Horatio Great's army at that point. Colonel Schuyler had been relieved of command by this time. And the 2 biggest factors with Burgoyne's surrender were the sheer numbers of militia that eventually went to join the Northern Army, as well as his lack of supplies, lack of food for his army. If we look at longer term impacts on a more local scale, everyone knew that the Tories would be back. They would be back to raid from Canada or from within. And forts were needed and defenses were needed. Troops were needed to protect from that. Schenectady had rebuilt its stockade in 1776. They were way ahead of us in the Schoharie Valley there. 3 forts were built in the Schoharie Valley later in 1777 and 1778. And by July and August of 1778, troops from the Continental Line of the 4th Pennsylvania, as well as 2 detachments of 2 companies of Morgan's Rifles were sent to Schoharie. And the war on the frontier would rage for another 5 more years, and increasingly destructive and increasingly bloody in these valleys. Now we're going to quote another historian about his take on the 2 battles. This is from Arthur Gregg's book called Old Helleberg, and this is Arthur Gregg's response to the Battle of Normanskill being called the Lost Battle of the Revolution. Not much of an engagement, you say, this Battle of Normanskill? Read what our state historian Alexander Fleck says of it. And this is a quote from the state historian. This brief encounter might be passed over lightly by one not familiar with conditions in Albany at the time, but it brought about results of the greatest importance. The Burgoyne campaign with Albany as its objective was on. Many families had fled, and terror was in the heart of every patriot, for did the British gain the old Dutch city, independence was lost. When the news reached Albany of the result, and that the principal Tories were in prison, there was great rejoicing. The report of the nearby victory over the Tories on the Normanskill and the flight of the Royalists from Schoharie was the forerunner of the news of the successful defense of Fort Stanwix. This lost battle of the Revolution became the turning point in rallying the spirits of the Patriots. The Second Continental Light Dragoons like to celebrate the Battle of the Flockey not only for routing the Tories, but also because it is considered to be the first cavalry charge of the United States Army, and they're very serious about celebrating that, and they've been back to Schoharie on numerous occasions to do so, and will do so again in 2027. This is a little plug for that. These are some of the dragoons when they were there last time. This particular guy is attaching the swivel to his carbine. The carbine was actually tied to the dragoon's body so that if he dropped it on horseback, he could recover it without losing the weapon, and it also could be fired from horseback. The Battle of Normanskill will also be reenacted in 2027 in Gelderland. This is one of the pistols of the type that the dragoons carried, and I'm going to go over just briefly. We're short on time. I guess I have a few more minutes.
Yeah, you can keep going.
This is some information that's recently come to light about these two battles. Nothing in history gets discovered, and always gets rediscovered in my mind because somebody had to put it there sometime. But I think we pointed out that the Rhode Island troops were not anywhere near the Battle of Normanskill. There's proof both that the Rhode Island troops were not there, and there's proof that the 9th Massachusetts troops were there. So this sign, you're going to have to just close your eyes when you drive by from now on. Or if you're driving, just shake your head. But I think Gilliland and Albany County have some plans to replace it. And this sign is not alone. There's the Middle Fort sign that I had in the presentation earlier for Fort Defiance. That one has some very misleading historical information as well. And this sign has been in place since 1954, and the Rhode Island troop narrative goes back to 1845 to Sims. And it's one of many mistakes that were made at that point, but that's how history evolves. The other thing that has come to light within the last year and a half, and I already pointed out some of that out, was the Battle of Normanskill and the exact location of the barn there. This is one of the maps that was used by a Albany County legislator, actually, named Jeff Purley, who did the research with some old maps and some old property records that made it clear that there had been some misinformation and some misunderstanding about where the Nicholas Van Patten farm actually was. The Banker farm and the Van Patten farm had been juxtaposed at some point in history, and he was able to sort that out, and within the last year or so, they've discovered, that that's where the battle took place, at that barn on Bosberg Road. This is the 1767 Bleecker map, and this is the Albany Road and the Normanskill intersecting here. Just an example of one of the maps that he used. This is a document that I found at the bottom of a very deep rabbit hole at the New York State Archives after much searching. This is another part of the copy that I passed around to you there. This is a statement by Jacob Zimmer that was made in a few years after the Battle of Flockey, but he was a prisoner of the Tories. And he, I think, in some ways answers the question as to why the Tories at Swartz Farm did not attack Fort Defiance when they had every chance to. And Jacob Zimmer said this in his statement about the Tories. He said, "There were such among them who had arms and would not fight." And I think the bottom line is the war of the Revolution came reluctantly to the valleys of upstate New York, and not everyone was willing to accept it at first until they had to. So with that, I'll leave you with the Dragoons, and I hope you can join us in 2027 at the Normanskill and at the Flockey. Thank you very much.
folks wanna get up, I think that that would be okay also. I know that these are tight seats. But I think we have time for questions if anyone has any.
Anybody? Yes.
I wanted to know how many were in the secondary rooms, how many did that include?
There were 28. 28 in that particular room. Yeah.
And they came from Albany?
They came from Albany. There's pretty good, there was, times in history, there's been, speculation that they came from Kingston and that they were not the Continental Light Dragoons, that it was a militia cavalry unit, but there was no way that Harper had time in 2 days to get to Kingston and back. So,
Were there a lot of those dragoons, or was it just a few?
28.
No.
Oh.
Bunches, regiments of dragoons.
I'm not sure how many there were altogether.
I think there were 4 continental regiments and also state below, but not many.
Right, okay. Some people know more about that than I do.
But how many were in a regiment?
They were not the same numbers of troops that you would have with an infantry regiment by any means. Yes, back there.
Is this Fort Defiance right across the way?
No, this is the lower fort that would be fortified and built in 1772, but fortified in 1777 after the Battle of Flockey. Fort Defiance was in Middleburg, and there's nothing left of it now, other than a few depressions in the ground that where the foundation was originally. That photograph that we have there is the only known photo of it, as it was essentially in ruins at that point, although it had not collapsed.
Mark,
Yes,
Fort Defiance, in relation to where the Middleburg Old Dutch Reformed Church is, or just Reformed Church now, where was Fort Defiance?
it was up that same street that the little Reformed church is on.
So Middle Fort Road.
Yeah, Jeff can tell you more accurately, but it's not necessarily near where the Middle Fort sign is by any means, but that's
Okay.
the closest point on the main road.
But the sign is on Route 30.
The sign is on Route 30, yes. But the fort was quite a ways off of Route 30. Yes,
Would you like me to try and answer her question a little more?
yes,
Okay. Quick answer is, I don't know, but here's some context. Okay, during the Battle of Saratoga, I've never heard of any cavalry, so there couldn't have been many American cavalry. Also, and it was kind of a weird historical military mix-up thing that we happened